The wind moves first long before the archaeologist's hand touches the ground. It passes over the flat brown plains of Mesopotamia, over cracked earth, dry riverbeds, ruined tells and fields where barley once rose in shimmering green bands beside canals cut by human labour. It lifts dust from places that no longer have names, carries it across the old courses of the Tigris and Euphrates, and scatters it over mounds where whole cities sleep beneath layers of mud brick. Somewhere in this landscape, still hidden, still unidentified, lies the vanished heart of Akkad, the capital of the first empire that ever tried to hold much of the known world beneath one command. Its kings called themselves rulers of the four quarters. Their armies crossed mountains and deserts. Their scribes wrote orders that travelled farther than any city-state's authority had travelled before. Their sealed statues and inscriptions spoke in a voice of conquest, confidence, and permanence. Then the voice breaks. The empire contracts, the names thin out, cities rebel, rain fails, strangers move through the margins, the royal line loses its grip, and Akkad, the city that gave its name to an age, slips so completely from the visible world that even its ruins have not been securely found. This is not a simple story of one city being destroyed or one king losing a war. It is the story of a political experiment so early and so ambitious that the people who lived through it may not have had a word for what they had created. Before Akkad, southern Mesopotamia was a land of powerful cities, each proud of its own gods, walls, canals, rulers and fields. Uruk-ur-Lagash, Kish-Nippur and others competed for land and prestige in a world where irrigation made life possible, but also made conflict inevitable. Water had to be controlled, labour had to be organised, and boundaries between fields could become matters of life and death. Kings had already risen, armies had already marched, and scribes had already learned to turn clay into memory. Yet Akkad changes the scale. Under Sargon and his successors, power no longer stops at the walls of one city or at the border of a single river plain. It reaches outward, binding Sumer and Akkad, the south and the north, the irrigated lowlands and the routes to timberstone metal and distant trade. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the mystery of Akkad is not only that it vanished, the deeper mystery is that it rose so suddenly, burned so brightly, reshaped the political imagination of the ancient Near East, and then left behind a silence large enough for later generations to fill with curses, legends and warnings. The landscape itself holds part of the answer. Mesopotamia is often described as the land between rivers, but that phrase can make it sound gentler than it was. The rivers gave life, but they did not give it easily. They flooded at dangerous times. They shifted channels. They left some places wet and others exposed. In the south, rainfall was not enough to support large populations, so people depended on canals, embankments, reservoirs, and carefully timed labour. A city was not only a cluster of houses and temples. It was a machine for managing water grain workers, animals, land records, offerings, and debt. It was also a sacred landscape, where the god of the city was imagined as the true owner of its fields, and the king or governor acted as steward, warrior, builder, and negotiator between heaven and earth. What survives in the record suggests a society already skilled at administration long before Akkad became an empire. Clay tablets recorded rations, livestock labour teams, deliveries of beer, wool, grain and oil. These are not glamorous records, but they are the bones of ancient power. And yet beside these practical records, something more human and more fragile appears. The Mesopotamians understood that cities could rise and fall. They saw abandoned mounds around them. They knew that flood, famine, war and divine displeasure could erase what seemed secure. A mud brick city always carried its own decay inside it. bricks melted in rain, walls needed repair, canals silted up, fields could become salty from centuries of irrigation. A ruler who failed to maintain the balance between labour, water, food and loyalty might discover that his power was less solid than it looked. Akkad would magnify this truth across a much larger stage. The empire's disappearance is made more haunting by a strange imbalance in the evidence. We know the names of its great kings. We know that Sargon became a figure of almost legendary force. We know that Naram-Sin, his grandson, claimed a status beyond ordinary kingship and was shown wearing the horned helmet of divinity. We have inscriptions that speak of campaigns to distant places of defeated rulers, captured cities and offerings to gods. We have administrative traces, cylinder seals, art styles, later copies of royal texts and memories preserved by scribes long after the empire itself was gone. But the capital Akkad remains elusive. Scholars still debate its location. It may lie beneath later settlement, buried under alluvium, hidden near a shifted river course, or destroyed beyond easy recognition. The city that once projected authority over Mesopotamia is for now almost a ghost in its own story. This absence matters. When a capital can be excavated, it often gives a civilization a centre of gravity. Palaces, temples, streets, workshops, graves, fortifications, archives, and trash pits can restore texture to the past. They show how power worked not only in royal claims but in daily routines. Akkad denies us that certainty. Instead, its empire has to be reconstructed from fragments scattered across other places, from cities that obeyed, resisted, remembered, or rewrote its history. This makes the Akkadian Empire feel both enormous and strangely hollow, like a shadow cast by an object that has disappeared. The old story of its fall was shaped by later literature. In one famous tradition, Akkad collapses because Naram-Sin offends the gods, especially by violating the sacred city of Nippur. The gods withdraw their favour. Famine spreads. Order breaks. The Gutians descend from the mountains like a punishment. The empire is not merely defeated, it is morally judged. For ancient listeners, this was not just history. It was a warning about kingship arrogance and sacred limits. But modern historians have to move carefully. The Curse of Akkad is powerful, but it is not a neutral report. It was written later, shaped by theology and political memory. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the collapse. What makes Akkad so compelling is that several kinds of disaster seem to converge. There is evidence for political strain, rebellions under major kings, the difficulty of controlling many cities, and the problem of keeping local elites loyal. There is evidence for military pressure from groups outside the imperial heartland, though the exact role of the Gutians remains debated. There is also environmental evidence suggesting a major arid episode around the late 3rd millennium BCE, often connected with the wider 4.2 kiloyear event. In parts of northern Mesopotamia and neighbouring regions, settlement patterns shift in ways that may reflect drought abandonment or migration. If rainfall decreased and harvests failed, the empire's grain supply tax system and military logistics would have been strained at the worst possible moment. A state built on extraction needs surplus. When surplus shrinks, loyalty becomes expensive. Still, the story should not be reduced to climate alone. Drought does not automatically destroy an empire. War does not automatically erase a capital. Rebellion does not always end a dynasty. But when environmental pressure, political resentment, military overreach, and ideological fragility meet, even a superpower can become brittle. Akkad may have been the first empire, but it would not be the last to discover that ruling many peoples is easier to announce in inscriptions than to sustain across generations. So the dust keeps moving over Mesopotamia, over the mounds and the dry fields, over places where the names of kings were pressed into clay and then forgotten. Somewhere beneath that dust lies the beginning of the imperial history, not as a clean origin story, but as a warning from deep time. Akkad rose from a world of competing cities and imagined something larger. It gathered soldiers, scribes, gods, roads, tribute and fear into a new kind of power. For a while it worked. Then the rivers shifted, the rains weakened, the cities resisted, and the empire that claimed the 4 quarters of the world vanished into fragments. Long before Akkad casts its shadow across Mesopotamia, the south is already crowded with ambition. The land is low, flat, and difficult to read at first glance, a world of reed marshes, mud flats, slow canals, shimmering fields, and cities raised slightly above the floodplain on accumulated layers of human life. Nothing about it seems designed for empire. There are no great forests to supply timber. There are few local sources of good stone. Metal has to come from far away. Rainfall is unreliable, and in many places it is simply not enough. Yet this demanding landscape becomes one of the earliest laboratories of urban civilization, because the very things it lacks force people to organize, record, negotiate, and command. A city here is not a luxury, it is a survival system. In the centuries before, Sargon southern Mesopotamia is not one kingdom, but a mosaic of city-states. Each city has its own sacred identity, its own patron deity, its own ruling house, its own fields, canals, workshops, and rivalries. Uruk is ancient and prestigious, already carrying memories of a deep urban past. Has access to the Gulf and the southern trade routes. Lagash and Umma fight bitterly over boundary lands and irrigation rights. Nippur holds religious importance beyond its political size because it is linked to Enlil, one of the great gods of the Sumerian world. Kish, farther north, carries a special royal aura, and later rulers will use the title King of Kish as if it means more than local control. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives suggests a region where power is always local, always contested, and always tied to water. The canals are the hidden arteries of this world. They bring river water into fields, feed barley crops, support date palms, water animals, and connect settlements. But canals also create dependence. A broken embankment can ruin harvests. A silted channel can starve fields. A dispute upstream can become a crisis downstream. Control of water means control of food, and control of food means control of labor. This is why the early Mesopotamian city is not merely a settlement with walls. It is an administrative engine. Temples and palaces collect goods, distribute rations, sponsor work crews, organize long-distance exchange, and record obligations. Clay tablets preserve the everyday machinery of life. Grain measured out, sheep counted, labourers assigned jars of beer, delivered wool-weighed fields surveyed. These little records, dry and repetitive as they may seem, reveal something extraordinary. By the time Akkad rises, Mesopotamia already knows how to manage complexity. It also knows how to fight. The older image of Sumer as a peaceful temple civilization has not survived the evidence. Cities compete. Rulers boast of victory. Boundary stones, inscriptions, and later traditions preserve conflicts that may seem small compared with imperial conquest, but for the people involved they are existential. A strip of fertile land between Lagash and Umma can justify generations of violence. Armies are not yet the vast imperial forces of later ages, but they are organized enough to change history. Soldiers march with spears, shields, axes, and bows. Chariots or heavy carts appear in early imagery, pulled by equids, not the fast horse-drawn chariots of later empires, but still symbols of elite war. Captives can become labor. Defeat can mean humiliation before the gods. Victory can be written into the landscape through monuments and temple offerings. One lesser-known detail of this pre-Akkadian world is how much of its power depends on institutions that are not always easy to separate. Modern words like temple, palace, economy, and state can be useful, but in early Mesopotamia they overlap in ways that resist simple categories. A temple is a sacred place, but it is also a landholder, employer, storage center, and redistributor. A ruler is a military leader, but also a builder of canals and a servant of the city's god. A scribe is a record keeper, but also a participant in a system that turns spoken obligations into durable authority. Even writing itself begins not as literature, but as administration, as a way of tracking goods, labor, and promises in a world too complex for memory alone. The First Empire will inherit this scribal technology and stretch it across a much wider map. This older Sumerian city world is not backward or waiting passively for Akkadian conquest. It is creative, wealthy, sophisticated, and politically restless. Its people build temples on platforms, produce fine metalwork and carved seals, compose hymns and myths, manage herds and fields, brew beer, trade for lapis lazuli, copper, timber, and stone, and imagine their cities as sacred centers of cosmic order. But the same achievements that make the city-states strong also make them vulnerable. Their rivalries prevent unity. Their irrigation systems require constant cooperation, but often produce conflict. Their elites are tied to local gods and local prestige, making broader loyalty difficult. Their wealth attracts ambitious rulers. Their administrative tools make control possible, but their political fragmentation invites someone to use those tools at a larger scale. By the time Sargon appears, the idea of kingship has already changed. Earlier rulers may call themselves governors or city lords, but some begin to claim broader titles and wider authority. Lugal-Sagesi of Umma, just before Sargon, is said to have conquered several major Sumerian cities and claimed rule from the Lower Sea to the Upper Sea language that gestures toward a world larger than one city's fields. Scholars still debate the exact reach of his power, because royal inscriptions often turn ambition into geography, but his career shows that Mesopotamia is already moving toward consolidation. The old city-state order is under pressure from men who imagine command on a regional scale. Sargon does not invent ambition from nothing. He enters a world already prepared for a stronger hand. Yet what Akkad will do is different. Earlier conquerors may defeat cities and claim supremacy, but Akkad builds a longer-lasting structure of domination. It draws on northern and southern traditions, on Semitic Akkadian language, and Sumerian scribal culture, on military force and administrative control, on the prestige of old sacred cities and the energy of a new royal center. It benefits from roads, canals, trade networks, and the accumulated knowledge of generations of scribes. It takes the competitive world of Sumer and turns its own tools against it. The temple accounts, the ration lists, the land surveys, the royal inscriptions, the habit of obedience to organized authority, all of these become raw material for empire. There is something almost inevitable in this, though, only in hindsight. No one living in those cities could know that the age of independent Sumerian rivalry was about to be transformed. A farmer repairing a canal bank near Lagash, a brewer delivering jars to a temple storehouse, a scribe pressing numbers into wet clay, a priest overseeing offerings at Nippur, a soldier standing at a city gate, each belongs to a local world, bounded by familiar gods and rival neighbors. But beyond those boundaries, pressure is building. Trade routes tie distant regions together. Warfare teaches rulers how to mobilize men and resources. Writing gives power a longer reach. Sacred kingship gives conquest a language of legitimacy. The stage is ready not because Mesopotamia is peaceful, but because it is already organized, wealthy, divided, and tense. Akkad will rise from this tension. It will not descend upon an empty land. It will seize a world full of cities that already know how to count grain, command labor honor. Kings fear armies and remember victories. The first superpower begins not with a blank map, but with a crowded one. Out of this crowded world comes Sargon, a figure who stands with one foot in history and the other in legend. He is one of the first individuals from the ancient past whose name still feels sharp across more than 4,000 years. Yet the closer one looks at his beginnings, the more the ground turns uncertain. Later, Mesopotamian tradition gives him a dramatic origin, the kind of story ancient societies often attach to founders whose power seems too large for ordinary birth. He is said to have been born in secrecy, placed in a reed basket sealed with bitumen, and set upon a river where he is found and raised by a gardener before rising to serve a king. It is a powerful image the abandoned child carried by water into destiny. But scholars still debate how much, if any, of this tale preserves real memory. It was written down long after Sargon lived, and like many royal birth legends, it may reveal more about how later people imagined greatness than about what actually happened. The historical Sargon is harder to see but not invisible. What survives in the record suggests a man who rises in the orbit of Kish, a city whose name already carries special political weight. Later texts describe him as cupbearer to Urzababa, king of Kish. This title can sound humble to modern ears, almost domestic, but in ancient courts, a cupbearer could stand close to the ruler, close enough to hear decisions, witness tensions, and understand the machinery of power from inside the palace. Whether Sargon truly held that exact position, or whether later scribes shaped the story for dramatic contrast, the idea is revealing. His rise is remembered not as the smooth inheritance of a prince, but as the ascent of an outsider, a servant, a man who steps from proximity into command. At some point, Sargon breaks from the world that produced him. The details are obscure. There is no surviving contemporary chronicle that calmly explains how he seized power, whom he betrayed, which armies first followed him, or how quickly his authority grew. Instead, there are royal claims, later copies, and echoes preserved by scribal tradition. He establishes or takes control of Akkad, the city that becomes his capital, and gives its name to the empire. Yet here the mystery deepens because Akkad itself remains undiscovered. The city from which Sargon projects power over Mesopotamia is still a missing center known from texts, but not securely placed on the map. It may have stood somewhere in northern Babylonia, perhaps near the meeting zone between the Sumerian south and the Semitic-speaking north, a strategic position from which Sargon could dominate both. But the evidence remains incomplete, and the capital's absence makes Sargon's early career feel almost suspended in air. What is clearer is that Sargon defeats Lugalzagisi, the powerful ruler who had already brought much of Sumer under his influence. This confrontation matters because it marks more than a battle between two ambitious men. Lugalzagisi represents the last great attempt of the old Sumerian city-state world to produce a regional conqueror from within its own pattern of rivalry. Sargon represents something newer, or at least something more durable. Later accounts say that Sargon captured Lugalzagisi and displayed him in humiliation before the god Enlil at Nippur. Whether every detail is exact or shaped by royal propaganda, the message is unmistakable. Sargon does not merely defeat a rival. He seeks recognition at the sacred center of Sumerian legitimacy. He understands that conquest is not enough. Power must be seen, recorded, sanctified, and made believable. From there, Sargon's ambition widens. His inscriptions and later traditions describe campaigns across Sumer against cities that had long guarded their independence. Uruk, Lagash, and others are drawn into the new order. The language of the records is often formulaic, full of defeated enemies and conquered places, but beneath the royal boasting lies a real transformation. For the first time, a ruler is able to impose sustained authority across the heartland of Mesopotamian urban civilization. He does not simply raid and withdraw. He binds, he appoints, he collects. He turns victory into administration. One surprising feature of Sargon's empire is that it is not only a military creation, it also depends on cultural flexibility. Akkadian, a Semitic language, grows in official importance, but Sumerian traditions remain essential. The empire does not erase the old cities or their gods, it uses them. Sargon's family places royal daughters in powerful religious roles, including at Ur, where his daughter Enheduanna becomes high priestess of the moon god Nanna. Enheduanna is one of the most remarkable figures of the age, remembered by later tradition as a poet and priestess, and often described as the earliest named author known from world literature. Scholars still debate the authorship and transmission of the works associated with her, but her role itself reveals Akkadian strategy with unusual clarity. The empire reaches into sacred institutions not merely to worship, but to govern through them. This is the genius of Sargon's rise. He understands, or at least his regime discovers, that Mesopotamia cannot be ruled by force alone. The old cities are too proud, too sacred, too administratively mature. Their temples matter, their priesthoods matter, their local elites matter. Their gods cannot be ignored. So Akkad presents itself as both conqueror and guardian. It punishes rebellion but honors sanctuaries. It claims supremacy while borrowing the symbols of those it rules. It speaks the language of kingship familiar to Sumer but stretches that language into an imperial form. Still, the violence should not be softened. Empire begins with broken resistance. Cities that had once fought one another now face a power capable of defeating them in sequence and compelling obedience beyond a single campaign season. Soldiers march farther. Governors or loyal officials appear where independent rulers once stood. Tribute and labor flow toward the center. Scribes press new patterns of authority into clay. A king's name travels along routes where local names once mattered more. For those who benefit from imperial order, Akkad may bring access, security, prestige, and wider exchange. For those who lose autonomy, it brings humiliation, taxation, and the presence of outsiders in familiar sacred spaces. Sargon's own image grows beyond his lifetime because his achievement is so difficult to forget. Later Mesopotamian kings look back to him as a model of conquest. Stories gather around him. His name becomes a symbol of the ruler who rises from obscurity and masters the world. But the real Sargon, the man behind the legend, was likely more practical than mythical, a political survivor, a military organizer, a reader of weak points, a ruler who knew when to destroy and when to absorb. He rises because Mesopotamia is ready to be unified by force, but he endures in memory because he turns conquest into a new political imagination. And yet from the beginning, Akkad carries a danger inside its triumph. Its authority is wider than any ruler's immediate presence. Its legitimacy depends on cities that remember independence. Its administration must stretch across languages, landscapes, gods, and rival elites. Sargon builds something unprecedented, but unprecedented things are rarely stable at first. The empire begins as a miracle of ambition. It also begins as a problem waiting to unfold. Once Sargon's victories become more than a sequence of battles, Akkad has to solve the problem that every empire after it will inherit: how to make distant obedience feel real. A city can be conquered in a day, frightened for a season, stripped of goods, and forced to swear loyalty before its gods, but none of that guarantees that it will remain obedient when the army leaves. The first flash of imperial conquest is dramatic. The quieter work that follows is more difficult. Akkad has to turn movement into structure, fear into routine, and royal command into something that can survive distance, local resentment, and the stubborn memory of older independence. The empire's machine is built from tools Mesopotamia already knows, but it arranges them on a larger scale. Soldiers remain essential because no city-state gives up power simply because a distant king requests it. Akkadian rulers rely on military force to suppress rebellion, guard routes, intimidate rivals, and display the cost of resistance. Yet armies need food, animals, weapons, roads, information, and a reason to keep moving. Behind every campaign stands a less visible world of grain stores, ration systems, scribes, messengers, officials, and labourers. The empire's true strength lies not only in its ability to win battles, but in its ability to make victories administratively useful afterward. Governors and loyal officials become crucial. In some conquered places, Akkad appears to replace local rulers or reduce them to dependent status. In others, it may work through existing elites, allowing old families to survive if they accept the new order. The evidence remains incomplete, and the exact arrangement probably varies from city to city, but the general pattern is clear enough. Akkad does not rule only by standing armies camped everywhere at once. It rules through a network of delegated authority. The king's power is extended by men who collect dues, supervise labour, oversee estates, relay commands, and keep watch over local politics. This creates reach, but it also creates risk. Every official is a bridge between the centre and the province, and every bridge can carry loyalty in either direction. Writing gives the empire memory beyond the human voice. Clay tablets are small things, but in the Akkadian world they become instruments of control. They preserve accounts, personnel, lists, deliveries, land transactions, and administrative decisions. They allow the movement of goods to be checked, promises to be recorded, and orders to outlast the moment of speaking. This does not mean Akkad has a modern bureaucracy in the full sense. It does not have paper ministries, printed laws, or a state archive in the way later empires will. But by the standards of the 3rd millennium BCE, it possesses a remarkable ability to countersign, extract, and remember. Power becomes something pressed into wet clay and hardened by time. The seal is another quiet weapon of government. Cylinder seals rolled across clay leave miniature scenes and identifying marks that authenticate goods, containers, doors, and documents. They are beautiful objects often carved with gods, heroes, animals, combat ritual, and symbols of authority, but their beauty should not distract from their function. A seal can stand for a person's responsibility. It can mark a transaction as official. It can make administration visible. During the Akkadian period, seal art develops a distinctive energy, with muscular figures, divine encounters, and scenes that feel more dynamic than many earlier examples. This is a lesser-known but revealing detail. Imperial style travels through objects small enough to fit in a hand. The empire is not only proclaimed in monuments, it is rolled again and again across clay in storerooms, offices, and workshops. Akkad also depends on roads and river routes. Though roads should not be imagined as a paved imperial highway in the later Roman sense. Movement follows tracks, canals, river corridors, caravan paths, and established trade routes linking plains, mountains, and deserts. Messengers carry information. Merchants and officials move goods. Soldiers march toward rebellious cities or distant frontiers. The empire's claims extend toward regions that supply resources. Mesopotamia lacks timber from the west or north, stone from uplands, metals from distant mountains, luxury materials from even farther networks. Royal inscriptions speak of campaigns to lands such as Elam Subatu, Mari Ebla, and regions near the Mediterranean or beyond, though scholars still debate the exact nature and depth of Akkadian control in many of these places. Some areas may have been directly ruled, others may have paid tribute, accepted temporary domination, or simply entered the royal imagination as symbols of reach. This distinction matters. Ancient kings often described the world as if victory in a campaign meant permanent possession. A defeated city becomes part of the king's glory, even if its obedience later weakens. A distant land that sends gifts may be presented as submissive. A trade contact may be folded into the language of domination. No single explanation fully accounts for every Akkadian claim, and modern historians have to separate military presence, political control, economic influence, and royal propaganda. Still, even if some claims are exaggerated, the scale of Akkadian activity is remarkable. The empire projects power across a far broader horizon than earlier city-state rulers had sustained. At the centre of all this stands the king, not merely as a commander, but as the point where military force, divine favour, economic extraction, and political identity meet. Sargon and his successors present themselves as chosen by great gods, especially Ishtar or Inanna in some traditions, and as legitimate rulers over lands whose local gods must also be honoured. This is a delicate balancing act. The king must be above the cities, yet he must not appear to be an enemy of the sacred order that gives cities meaning. He must take tribute without looking like a mere robber. He must appoint officials without provoking every local elite into revolt. He must be terrifying enough to prevent rebellion, but reliable enough to make submission seem survivable. The empire's wealth comes from many streams. Agricultural surplus remains the foundation, especially grain from irrigated fields. Labour obligations support building canal maintenance, transport, and military supply. Tribute brings animals, metals, textiles, timber, stone, and prestige goods. Temples and palaces continue to manage large households and estates. The Akkadian state does not replace every older institution, it plugs itself into them. This may be one reason it can expand so quickly. Instead of building everything from nothing, it captures existing systems of production and redirects part of their output toward the imperial center. But every system of extraction creates pressure. For a local farmer empire may appear not as a grand historical transformation, but as another demand on Bali Labason's animals or time. For a city priesthood, Akkadian rule may mean negotiation between sacred prestige and political submission. For a local ruler, it may mean survival at the cost of humiliation. For a scribe, it may bring employment and status, but also the burden of serving a power that distant people resent. What survives in the record tends to preserve the view from above, yet the empire must have been felt most sharply below, in the counting of grain, the conscription of workers, and the arrival of orders carrying a royal name. Akkad's imperial machine is therefore both impressive and fragile. It can gather resources from many cities, but it depends on those cities continuing to produce. It can appoint officials, but officials can fail or rebel. It can invoke divine favour, but disaster can make divine favour look doubtful. It can march armies across great distances, but armies consume what they are meant to protect. It can use writing to stabilise power, but writing also preserves evidence of strain. The wider the empire reaches, the more it must hold together things that naturally pull apart. For a time the machine works. Akkad becomes more than a conqueror's camp. It becomes a new political form, one that later kings will admire, imitate, and fear. Its command moves across rivers, cities, temples, routes, and borders. Its officials press seals into clay. Its soldiers enforce obedience. Its royal names enter memory. Yet beneath the rhythm of administration, one question remains unanswered. How long can the first empire keep turning before the weight of its own reach begins to grind against it? At its height, Akkad is not simply a line of kings and campaigns. It is a lived world spread across cities that still smell of river mud smoke, animals, grain sweat oil and baked brick. The empire exists in royal inscriptions, but it also exists in the ordinary morning of a labourer stepping into a field, a scribe preparing damp clay, a woman grinding barley, a soldier watching a gate, a priest entering a temple courtyard, and a merchant calculating the risk of a journey beyond the familiar plain. To understand Akkad at its strongest, it is necessary to look away from the throne for a moment and imagine what imperial power feels like in the streets below it. The cities remain older than the empire that rules them. Akkadian authority may stand above them, but Uruk is still Uruk, Ur is still Ur. Nippur still carries its sacred weight, and Lagash still remembers its own rulers and rivalries. Mud brick walls rise around dense neighbourhoods. Houses cluster around courtyards. Roofs are flat, useful for work storage and sleeping in hot weather. Narrow lanes twist between buildings. Dogs move through refuse. Donkeys carry loads. Reed baskets, wool, textiles. Clay jars, copper tools and wooden objects pass through hands whose names are usually lost. In the heat of the day, the city can feel heavy and close, but at its edges the canals open the world, and beyond them lie fields that feed gods, kings, soldiers and children alike. The temple remains one of the great centres of urban life. Even under Akkadian rule, temples are not decorative monuments standing apart from society. They are economic institutions, ritual centres, landholders, employers, storehouses and symbols of civic identity. Their courtyards receive offerings. Their storerooms hold grain oil, wool and valuables. Their personnel include priests, singers, administrators, craftsmen and workers. Akkadian kings understand that controlling Mesopotamia means respecting, influencing, and sometimes occupying these sacred systems. A city's god cannot be treated as a local superstition to be swept aside. The god is woven into land rights festivals, labour law, memory and fear. To offend a temple is to offend more than priests. It is to disturb the order through which a city understands itself. This is why royal family members placed in religious offices matter so much. Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon, is not just an ornament of dynasty. As high priestess at Ur, she represents the empire's ability to enter the sacred heart of a major Sumerian city without destroying its traditions outright. Her position links Akkadian power with the old religious landscape. It also shows that imperial strategy can move through ritual as well as through armies. Scholars still debate how much of the literary corpus attributed to her comes directly from her own hand or later transmission, but her remembered role remains extraordinary. In a world dominated in its official records by kings and male officials, the imperial project passes through the voice and office of a royal woman. In the markets and workshops, empire is felt through materials. Mesopotamia is poor in many natural resources, and this poverty creates wide horizons. Timber must come from distant forests. Copper and other metals arrive from uplands and trade networks. Hard stone, lapis lazuli, shell, and other prized materials travel across dangerous routes. The Akkadian Empire sits inside this web of exchange, trying to command, tax, protect, or exploit it. Merchants and officials are not always easy to separate because trade and state power often overlap. Some goods move as tribute. Some move through temple and palace institutions. Some pass through private hands. What survives in the record suggests a world where distance is both opportunity and vulnerability. The empire wants the wealth of far places, but far places are expensive to control. The people of Akkad's cities live under layers of obligation. A farmer may owe grain labour or service. A craft worker may produce goods for an institution. A herder may be responsible for animals counted and recorded by scribes. Workers receive rations of barley oil or wool. These rations are not just food, they are proof of an organized system in which human labor is measured and distributed. The clay tablet reduces a person's work to marks, but behind every mark is a body moving through heat, thirst, fatigue, and routine. The grandeur of empire rests on these repeated acts. Canals do not clear themselves. Fields do not irrigate themselves. Walls do not repair themselves. Armies do not feed themselves. The imperial shadow falls longest over those whose labour leaves the smallest names. Akkadian rule also changes the atmosphere of authority. In an independent city-state, local identity is immediate. The ruler temple and god belong to a recognizable civic world. Under empire, a new name appears above the old order. The king of Akkad may be far away, yet his official soldiers' seals and demands arrive in the city. This creates a strange double vision. Daily life remains local, but ultimate authority is distant. The people still walk the same lanes, honor the same gods, and work the same fields. Yet part of what they produce now flows into a larger structure. Some may see advantage in this. Imperial peace can reduce local warfare open routes and bring prestige to collaborators. Others may experience it as intrusion. The evidence remains incomplete, but repeated rebellions under Akkadian kings suggest that many cities did not forget the taste of independence. The army is always present even when unseen. Soldiers are the hard edge of the system. They make the king's claims credible. They escort, intimidate, punish, and conquer. But soldiers are also men pulled from communities fed by fields, equipped by workshops, and led across difficult terrain. The empire's military success depends on coordination as much as courage. Campaigns into the mountains, the Syrian plains, Elam, or rebellious Sumerian cities require planning and supply. Each victory celebrated in royal language must have left behind exhaustion, widows, captives, wounded bodies, and displaced families. Ancient inscriptions rarely linger on such costs. They prefer defeated enemies and divine favour. But no empire expands without pain distributed unevenly across its subjects. At the height of Akkadian power, art gives the empire a face. Carved steles seal impressions, and sculpture show a new confidence in royal imagery. Figures become more forceful bodies, more dynamic gods and kings, more intensely staged. The famous victory imagery associated with Naram-Sin will later make this visual language unmistakable, but the broader Akkadian style already suggests a world fascinated by power in motion. Muscles strain, heroes grapple, divine symbols hover above human action. Order is shown not as stillness but as conquest, mastered and arranged. This art is not simple decoration. It teaches viewers how to see the empire as vigorous, chosen, disciplined, and terrifying. Yet beneath this confidence, Akkad remains a collection of places with different memories. The empire can command cities, but it cannot make them all feel the same. Sumerian and Akkadian languages coexist. Local cults continue. Regional loyalties survive. Old rivalries do not vanish. They are covered by a wider authority that must constantly prove itself. The empire's brilliance lies in its ability to hold these differences together for a time. Its danger lies in the fact that holding them requires continuous success. As long as harvests come, armies win, officials obey, and gods seem favourable, the system can appear solid. But if one part weakens, the others feel the strain. So Akkad at its height is not a golden age without tension. It is a dense, controlled, productive, anxious world. It is temples and tribute markets and military roads, sacred offices and forced labour, beautiful seals and heavy ration lists. It is the first great experiment in making many cities live beneath one political shadow. And for those who stand beneath that shadow, the empire is not an abstraction. It is the weight of grain owed the sound of orders spoken in another accent, the sight of a royal seal pressed into clay, and the knowledge that beyond the horizon sits a king whose name has become part of daily life. By the time Naram-Sin rises to the throne, Akkad is no longer an experiment carried only by the shock of Sargon's conquests. It has become a dynasty, and that matters. A conqueror may seize cities through talent, violence, timing, and luck, but a dynasty has to persuade the world that conquest can become inheritance. The empire must survive the death of its founder. It must pass through sons and grandsons without dissolving back into the old city-state rivalries beneath it. Naram-Sin inherits this enormous pressure, and under him the Akkadian Empire appears to reach its most dazzling height. His reign glows in the record with victory ambition and a kind of royal confidence so intense that later tradition remembers it with admiration and unease. He is the grandson of Sargon, and that alone places him beneath a heavy ancestral shadow. Sargon has already become the model of the world-conquering king, the man who rose from uncertain origins and bent Mesopotamia to his will. Naram-Sin must do more than preserve that inheritance. He must prove that the empire is still expanding, still chosen, still feared. His inscriptions present him as a ruler who crushes rebellion, defeats enemies across distant lands, and receives honors that push kingship into dangerous new territory. In his reign, the ruler of Akkad is not merely powerful, he becomes divine. The famous victory stele of Naram-Sin captures this transformation with unforgettable force. It shows the king climbing a mountain slope over defeated enemies, his body larger than those around him, his soldiers arranged beneath him, divine symbols above. He wears a horned helmet, the marker normally associated with divinity. The composition is not a stiff row of figures, but an upward surge of visual ascent. The king does not simply stand at the center of the world, he climbs toward the heavens. It is one of the most striking images from the ancient Near East, and it tells us that Akkadian royal ideology has crossed a threshold. The ruler is no longer only the servant favored by gods. He is presented as a godlike being in his own right. This is not a small change. In earlier Mesopotamian political thought, kingship is sacred, but the king's divinity is not usually stated so boldly. Naram-Sin's divine status suggests either extraordinary success, extraordinary insecurity, or perhaps both. To declare a living king divine may strengthen loyalty by lifting him above ordinary rivalry. It may also reveal how difficult the empire has become to hold together through older forms of legitimacy alone. Scholars still debate the exact reasons for this shift, but the evidence suggests that Naram-Sin's reign is marked by both triumph and strain. His divinity is not calm, it is charged with conquest. One of the most telling events of his reign is the Great Rebellion described in later inscriptions, when many cities are said to have risen against Akkad. The details are complicated and the records are shaped by royal boasting, but the broad message is clear. The empire's heartland does not remain obedient simply because the dynasty has survived. Cities that were conquered by Sargon, administered by his successors, and tied into imperial systems still look for moments to break away. Naram-Sin claims to defeat coalitions of rebels and restore order, but the need to proclaim such victories reveals the instability beneath imperial grandeur. A king who calls himself divine may still have to fight cities that remember they were once free. His campaigns extend far beyond southern Mesopotamia. Texts associate him with victories in regions such as Elam to the east, Subatu to the north, and lands toward the west. The mountain imagery of his victory stele is often linked to his defeat of the Lullaby, a people of the Zagros region, though as always the royal record must be read with caution. Ancient inscriptions compress complex frontier relationships into scenes of domination. Some enemies may have been raiders, Some may have been rival polities, some may have controlled roots metals or upland resources desired by the empire. What survives in the record suggests an Akkadian state still capable of projecting force across difficult landscapes, but also required to do so again and again. The frontier world is different from the irrigated cities of the south. Mountain steppe lands and dry zones do not submit in the same way canal cities do. Their people may be harder to count, tax and govern. They may move seasonally, control passes, retreat into terrain unfamiliar to lowland armies, or enter imperial history mainly when conflict erupts. Akkad's claim to rule the Four Quarters is therefore both a political statement and a geographic fantasy of total order. It imagines the world as something that can be named defeated and arranged beneath one king. The reality is rougher, edges fray. Distant groups submit, temporarily resist later, or remain outside full control while still appearing in royal victory lists. Naram-Sin's reign also shows how empire turns memory into performance. Victory must be repeated in text and stone. The king must be seen as unstoppable, because the empire depends on belief as well as force. His divine title, his monumental art, his military claims and his control of sacred centres all work together to create an atmosphere of inevitability. Yet inevitability is one of empire's favourite illusions. It looks strongest when it's most carefully staged. A lesser-known but revealing detail is that Naram-Sin's divinization seems to have been accompanied by changes in how his name appears with the divine determinative used before it, in some texts marking him as godlike in writing itself. This means his elevated status is not only carved into dramatic imagery, it enters the administrative and scribal habits of the empire. A sign placed before a name changes how that name is understood every time it is read. The divine king becomes part of the written order. Clay, the simplest material of the Mesopotamian world, carries the ideology of living divinity, but this ambition leaves a long aftertaste. Later, Mesopotamian literature often remembers Naram-Sin not only as a great king, but as a ruler whose arrogance brings catastrophe. The famous tradition of Akkad's curse places him at the centre of a moral drama, in which he violates sacred order and provokes divine punishment. Modern historians cannot treat that story as straightforward fact, but they also cannot ignore what it reveals about memory. Later scribes looked back at Akkad and saw a lesson about overreach. They imagined that the empire's height and its fall were connected, that the same king who climbed highest also exposed the danger of climbing too far. This does not mean Naram-Sin caused the collapse by pride alone. That is literature, theology, and political reflection, not simple history. But the legend preserves a truth that is harder to measure. Empires can become trapped by their own image. Once a king claims universal rule, every rebellion becomes a threat to cosmic order. Once he claims divine favour, every drought, defeat, or famine becomes a question mark hanging over his legitimacy. Once he lifts himself above ordinary kingship, failure becomes more than political, it becomes symbolic. Naram-Sin's Akkad is therefore magnificent and vulnerable at the same time. Its armies still march, its art still commands, its scribes still record. Its king rises visually toward the heavens wearing the horns of divinity, while enemies fall beneath his feet. Yet the very intensity of this image suggests a world under pressure. A stable empire does not need to shout forever. Akkad under Naram-Sin shouts in stone clay and conquered bodies, and for a moment the sound carries across Mesopotamia. But echoes fade, and beneath the divine king's mountain path the old cracks are still waiting. The cracks beneath Akkad do not appear all at once. They widen slowly through the ordinary problems that every ruler can understand and every empire tries to hide. A governor grows too independent. A city delays tribute. A canal needs repair, but labour is short. A harvest disappoints. A frontier people refuses to stay defeated. A priesthood cooperates in public while preserving its own loyalties in private. A royal inscription announces victory, but the same city rebels again a few years later. None of these pressures alone has to destroy an empire. Together they create a world where power must be constantly renewed, and constant renewal is exhausting. Akkad's first weakness is built into its success. It rules over cities that are older than itself, richer in memory, and deeply attached to their own gods. Sargon can defeat them, and Naram-Sin can crush their rebellions, but conquest does not erase civic identity. Uruk still remembers Uruk. Ur still belongs to Nana. Nippur still carries the authority of Enlil. Lagash still has its fields, canals, archives and older traditions of rivalry. These cities have been folded into an imperial system, but they are not blank provinces waiting to be shaped. They are proud local worlds with their own elites, temples and histories. The empire's administrators can collect grain and appoint officials, but they cannot easily make people forget that political life once centered closer to home. This local memory matters because Akkad depends on cooperation from precisely the people most capable of resisting it. Temple household scribes, land managers, merchants, military officers, and city elites all help the imperial machine function. They know where grain is stored, which fields are productive, which canals are vulnerable, which families matter, and which workers can be summoned. Without them, distant royal authority becomes clumsy. Yet these same groups can also conceal delay, redirect, or rebel. An empire can command from the centre, but it must see through local eyes. If those eyes become hostile, the king rules in partial darkness. The second weakness is distance. By later imperial standards, Akkad may seem small, but in its own age it stretches authority across a demanding world. Messages move only as fast as men and animals can carry them. Rivers help, but they also change. Roads are tracks, not permanent arteries of stone. A campaign into the mountains or toward the west requires food, water, draft animals, guides, and knowledge of terrain. Every mile increases the cost of control. A distant victory may impress the scribes, but holding the result is harder. Soldiers cannot be everywhere. Officials cannot watch every official beneath them. Rebellion can begin faster than a royal army can arrive. This is where imperial language becomes both useful and dangerous. Akkadian kings describe themselves as rulers of vast spaces, conquerors of distant lands, masters of the four quarters. Such language magnifies authority. It makes the empire seem natural, universal, almost inevitable. But it also raises the standard by which failure is judged. If a king claims the world, then every corner becomes a test. If a frontier group raids, if a city withholds tribute, if a route becomes unsafe, the claim begins to look fragile. The empire's ideology demands visible success, and visible success demands repeated military action. Akkad must keep proving what it says it already is. A third weakness lies in administration itself. The systems that allow Akkad to gather resources also create burdens. Grain must be collected, stored, transported, and redistributed. Labour must be assigned. Officials must be paid or rewarded. Soldiers must be supplied. Temples must be managed carefully enough to avoid sacrilege, but firmly enough to keep them politically useful. Every layer of control consumes some of the surplus it extracts. The empire is not simply taking wealth. It is spending wealth in order to keep taking wealth. That balance can work during strong harvests and military success. Under stress, it becomes unstable. The people below the elite may have felt these pressures most directly. A farmer does not experience imperial expansion as an abstract achievement. He experiences it as obligations measured in barley animals' labour days, or sons taken for service. A worker clearing a canal may not care whether the king rules the four quarters. He cares whether his ration arrives and whether his household survives the season. If the state demands more while giving less, resentment grows. The evidence remains incomplete because the poorest people rarely speak clearly in the surviving texts, but empires are always carried on backs that leave few inscriptions. When those backs bend too far, the upper structure trembles. There is also the problem of succession. Sargon's charisma cannot be inherited in full. Each new king must prove himself to soldiers, officials, cities and gods, Rimush and Manishtushu. Sargon's successors before Naram-Sin appear to have faced serious resistance, including rebellions in Sumerian cities. Their reigns remind us that the empire did not pass peacefully from triumph to triumph. The dynasty survives, but survival requires force. This pattern is important. Akkad is not collapsing only at the end. It is being challenged throughout its life. The later fall looks sudden from a distance, but the habit of rebellion is present much earlier. Frontier pressure adds another layer. To the east, Elam and the Zagros regions remain vital and difficult. To the north and west routes lead into lands with different political traditions and ecological conditions. The empire wants access to metal, stone, timber and trade, but control of these zones is costly. Mountain peoples and semi-mobile groups are not easily governed like canal cities. They can be defeated in royal inscriptions and still remain dangerous in practice. The Gutians, who later loom large in stories of Akkad's fall, belong to this broader problem of the imperial edge people, beyond the lowland system, who could enter the record as raiders, enemies, migrants, mercenaries or scapegoats depending on who was writing. Akkad also faces a subtler cultural strain. It is a Semitic-speaking dynasty ruling over deeply Sumerian sacred and scribal traditions, while also promoting Akkadian language and imperial identity. This does not mean simple ethnic conflict, a modern category that fits poorly here, but it does mean that the empire must navigate difference. It must present itself as legitimate in multiple cultural registers. It must speak to Sumerian temples, Akkadian officials, local rulers, distant allies and conquered enemies. This flexibility is one of its strengths, but flexibility takes work. A ruler who fails to honor the right god, appoint the right priestess, repair the right temple, or respect the right city's prestige may face consequences that are political and religious at once. In such a system, stability is not a condition. It is an achievement repeated day after day. Akkad has to keep canals functioning, cities obedient officials, loyal troops supplied gods, honoured routes open and harvests sufficient. When later generations remember the empire as cursed, they compress these pressures into a moral story. They imagine a single act of arrogance, a divine judgment, a punishment that explains everything. But the historical reality is heavier and more human. Akkad does not need one fatal flaw. It has many ordinary ones, each manageable in good times, each dangerous when combined. For now the empire still stands. Its kings still write in the language of victory. Its officials still seal tablets. Its cities still send grain. Its soldiers still march when rebellion rises. But beneath the surface, the machine is becoming harder to operate. The first superpower has discovered the central paradox of empire: the more it controls, the more it must control. Every conquest adds glory, but also distance. Every province adds wealth, but also administration. Every claim of universal rule adds prestige, but also risk. Akkad's shadow still covers the cities, yet shadows lengthen when the light begins to lower. Then the sky begins to matter in a different way. For generations, Mesopotamian kings can boast of armies, walls, temples, canals, and gods, but none of them can command the rain. In the deep south, irrigation draws life from the great rivers, yet the wider Akkadian world reaches beyond the most controlled canal landscapes. Northern Mesopotamia, the Jazeera, the steppe margins and the routes towards Syria, and the upper Tigris depend far more directly on rainfall. These regions are not empty edges. They are part of the web that supports cities' herds, trade grain movement and imperial reach. If the rains weaken there, the damage does not remain local. It travels through food supplies, migration, political unrest, and the fragile confidence that holds authority together. Around the late 3rd millennium BCE, evidence from several regions points toward a major episode of aridity, often connected with what researchers call the 4.2 kiloyear event. The name is modern and technical, but the possible human consequences are not. Lake sediments, dust records, cave deposits, changes in settlement patterns, and abandoned sites have all been used to explore a period when parts of the Near East appear to have become drier. Scholars still debate the timing, severity, regional variation, and exact impact of this climatic shift because climate does not strike every landscape equally, and archaeological evidence rarely speaks in a single clear voice. Still, the possibility is stark. Near the time Akkad begins to weaken, parts of the world it depends on may have been drying out. Drought in the ancient Near East is never just a lack of water, it is a chain reaction. Less rain means poorer pasture. Poorer pasture means stressed herds. Stressed herds mean less meat-milk wool traction and exchange. Failed harvests mean grain shortages, higher pressure on storage systems, and more competition for productive land. People from marginal areas may move toward better watered zones, not as invaders in the simple sense, but as families, herders, workers, or desperate communities searching for survival. Cities already under administrative strain may face newcomers, food shortages, disease, or unrest. A king can defeat an army. He cannot easily defeat a climate pattern that returns season after season. The northern plains are especially important in this story. While southern Mesopotamia depends on irrigation from the rivers, northern agricultural systems often rely more on rainfall. If drought reduces yields there, the empire loses more than grain. It loses stability across a broad zone that may have helped supply animals, people routes, and military access. Some archaeological sites in northern Mesopotamia show signs of disruption or abandonment around this period, though the pattern is uneven and still debated. Tel Leilan, often discussed in relation to Akkadian collapse, has yielded evidence interpreted by some scholars as reflecting abrupt aridification and settlement decline. But no single site can explain an empire, and no single environmental record can be stretched across all of Mesopotamia without caution. Even so, drought would have found Akkad at a vulnerable angle. The empire is an extraction system. It needs surplus to feed soldiers, reward officials, maintain temples, support workers, and display royal generosity. Surplus is not merely wealth, it is political oxygen. When harvests shrink, the centre has grim choices. It can demand the same amount from suffering provinces, provoking resentment. It can reduce demands, weakening the army and administration. It can shift burdens onto more productive regions, angering those populations. It can open storehouses if they are full enough, but stored grain is finite. The king's power may look divine on stone, but in practice it depends on barley arriving where it is needed. The psychological effect may have been just as dangerous. Mesopotamian kingship rests partly on the idea that the ruler maintains order under divine favour. A good king builds canals, feeds temples, defeats enemies, and keeps the land productive. When drought persists, the ordinary relationship between rule and blessing becomes strained. People do not need a modern theory of climate to understand hunger. They see cracked fields, low yields, dust weakened animals and empty storage jars. They hear rumors from other towns. They watch strangers moving along roads. They notice if officials still arrive to collect what the land no longer gives. In such a world, the confidence of empire begins to sound less convincing. Later literature remembers Akkad's fall through images of famine and disorder. The Curse of Akkad describes a world where hunger spreads, roads become unsafe, and ordinary life breaks down under divine anger. This is not a scientific report, and it should not be treated as eyewitness history. Yet poetic memory can preserve the shape of trauma even when it explains that trauma through theology. The image of a starving land may reflect cultural memories of real hardship, later organized into a moral story about royal offense and divine punishment. What survives in the record suggests that later Mesopotamians did not remember Akkad's end as a clean political transfer. They remembered it as a rupture. A lesser-known complication is that southern irrigation could both protect and endanger communities during drought. In theory, river-fed canals make the south more resilient than rain-fed northern fields. But irrigation systems require maintenance, labor coordination, and political order. If an empire is already strained, canals can silt up embankments, can fail, and disputes over water can intensify. Long-term irrigation also contributes to salinization, especially in southern Mesopotamia, where poor drainage can leave salts in the soil and reduce yields over time. Salinity was not unique to the Akkadian collapse and should not be treated as the single cause, but it forms part of the environmental background. The land that feeds civilization is powerful, but it is not endlessly forgiving. Climate also interacts with movement at the margins. If steppe or upland communities face harsher conditions, they may press toward river valleys and settled zones. Later texts blame the Gutians heavily for Akkad's fall, but environmental pressure may have turned many borderlands unstable. Some people may raid. Some may seek pasture. Some may enter service as soldiers or labourers. Some may be remembered by settled scribes only when they become threatening. The line between migration and invasion can be much clearer in royal propaganda than in lived reality. No single explanation fully accounts for this movement, but drought can make every frontier more volatile. The danger for Akkad is that climate stress does not need to overthrow the empire directly. It only needs to weaken the supports that are already under pressure. A hungry city is more likely to resist. An unpaid soldier is less reliable. A governor facing shortages may think first of his own region. A temple whose offerings decline may interpret the crisis through divine displeasure. A frontier group under stress may become harder to contain. A royal ideology built on abundance and conquest may stumble when the land itself stops cooperating. So the empire faces an enemy with no capital to capture. There is no single battlefield where Naram-Sin's successors can climb over the defeated body of drought and carve victory into stone. The sky withdraws slowly, unevenly, perhaps over years or decades, and the consequences seep into the machinery of rule. Grain becomes uncertain, movement increases, local loyalties tighten. The old cracks beneath Akkad meet a new dryness from above, and in that meeting the first superpower begins to learn a truth. Later empires will learn again and again power can organize the harvest, but it cannot guarantee that the harvest will come. When later Mesopotamian scribes looked back at the fall of Akkad, they did not write it as a weather report, a budget crisis, or a slow administrative failure. They wrote it as a wound in the moral order of the world. The empire had not merely weakened, it had offended heaven. Its hunger was not simply hunger, its disorder was not simply disorder. The collapse became a story of arrogance, desecration. Divine withdrawal and punishment gathered most famously in the composition now known as the Curse of Akkad. For anyone trying to understand what actually happened, this text is both a treasure and a trap. It preserves one of the most powerful memories of the empire's end, yet it explains that end through theology, poetry, and political lesson rather than neutral observation. In the story, Naram-Sin stands at the center of disaster. The divine king who once rose in victory imagery now becomes the ruler who loses divine favor. The gods, especially Enlil, turn against Akkad. Naram-Sin, frustrated by silence from the heavens, commits an act of sacrilege against Nippur, the sacred city of Enlil. After that, the world unravels. Akkad, once splendid, becomes desolate. Food disappears. Social order breaks apart. The Gutians descend as agents of chaos. The city's glory is replaced by ruin. The text is not subtle in its moral structure. Greatness becomes pride, pride becomes sacrilege, sacrilege becomes catastrophe. The empire falls because the cosmic balance has been violated. Modern historians cannot accept this as a literal explanation. The Curse of Akkad was composed after the events it describes, probably in a context where later rulers and scribes were reflecting on kingship legitimacy and the dangers of offending sacred institutions. It is not a contemporary archive entry. It does not give dates, troop numbers, harvest figures, or a precise sequence of political events. Its Naram-Sin may be less a documentary portrait than a literary figure shaped to carry a warning, and yet dismissing it entirely would be a mistake. Ancient literature often preserves emotional truths and cultural memories that administrative records cannot. A ration tablet can show grain distribution, but it cannot easily show how people made sense of a world that seemed to be failing. The curse tradition tells us that Akkad's fall was remembered as abnormal. It was not treated as just another dynasty giving way to another. The language of famine, violence, ruined roads, and divine abandonment suggests a memory of deep disruption. Whether every image reflects a specific historical event is impossible to prove, but the atmosphere is significant. Later scribes imagined Akkad as a city whose collapse required explanation on the scale of the gods. That alone says something about how large its shadow remained. Ordinary defeats do not usually need cosmic explanations. Akkad's end did. Nippur's role in the story is especially revealing. Nippur was not the largest political power in every period, but it held immense religious authority because of its connection with Enlil. To control Mesopotamia, kings needed Nippur's symbolic weight. To violate Nippur in literary memory was to attack the sacred foundation of legitimate rule. Whether Naram-Sin actually damaged the city, or whether later writers invented or exaggerated the event remains uncertain. Scholars still debate the historical core of the episode, but the choice of Nippur as the offended sacred center makes sense. The empire that had tried to rise above the old city world is shown failing because it mishandles the very sacred order that made kingship meaningful. This is one of the great ironies of Akkad. Its rulers were brilliant at using older institutions. They honored temples, placed royal family members in priestly roles, adopted Sumerian forms of legitimacy, and presented conquest as divinely sanctioned. But the same sacred world that strengthened them could also judge them. If harvests failed, if cities rebelled, if enemies advanced, the question was not only practical, it became theological. Had the king lost favor? Had the gods withdrawn? Had the ruler gone too far? Once Naram-Sin had been elevated toward divine status, the fall from confidence became even steeper. A king who claims more than ordinary kingship invites more than ordinary blame. The Curse of Akkad also transforms complex causes into a single moral chain. This is how societies often remember collapse. Slow processes are difficult to narrate. Administrative strain, climate variability, local resistance, frontier instability, and succession problems do not make a clean story. A curse does. It gives disaster a shape. It identifies a moment when the world went wrong. It gives the audience a reason to believe that chaos is not random, that suffering has meaning, and that future rulers can avoid it by respecting sacred limits. In that sense, the text is not merely about Akkad. It is about the needs of the societies that remembered Akkad. There is a lesser-known tension here between royal propaganda and later moral literature. During their own reigns, Akkadian kings present themselves as victorious, chosen, and unstoppable. Later scribes preserve those images but also invert them. Sargon becomes the ideal conqueror. Naram-Sin becomes both magnificent and dangerous. The same king who symbolizes imperial height becomes the figure through whom later tradition explains imperial ruin. This double memory is unusually rich. It suggests that Mesopotamians did not simply admire power, they admired it with suspicion. They knew that the king who reaches too high may endanger the land he claims to protect. The curse story also helps explain why the Gutians become so important in later accounts. They are not merely enemies, they are instruments of disorder outsiders whose arrival marks the breakdown of civilized life. But this too must be handled carefully. The Gutians did not emerge from myth. They were real people or groups associated with the Zagros region. Yet the literary portrayal of them is shaped by settled Mesopotamian fear of mountain outsiders and by the need to dramatize punishment. When a text describes foreign groups as chaotic, destructive, or barely human, it may reveal as much about the writer's worldview as about the people described. The evidence remains incomplete, and the real Gutians were likely more complicated than the curse tradition allows. What the curse cannot explain is why Akkad was vulnerable in the first place. A single act of sacrilege, even if it occurred, would not by itself empty fields, break supply systems, inspire rebellions, and undermine a dynasty across a broad region. The literary answer is powerful because it compresses many problems into one moral image. The historical answer has to remain messier. Drought may have reduced surplus. Rebellion may have stretched military resources. Frontier pressure may have worsened insecurity. Administrative costs may have risen. Local elites may have chosen autonomy when the centre weakened. Royal ideology may have become brittle under stress. No single explanation fully accounts for this, and that is precisely why the curse endured. It made sense of a collapse that history itself left fragmented. Still, there is something hauntingly accurate in the ancient instinct to connect arrogance with fragility. Akkad's rulers claimed a scale of control no one had sustained before. They spoke of distant lands, universal rule, and divine favour. They built a political language of supremacy. Yet the empire remained dependent on rain-grain canals, labour cooperation and belief. The curse tradition strips away the administrative details and leaves a stark lesson: power that forgets its limits can become dangerous to itself. That lesson is not a complete history, but it is not empty either. So the fall of Akkad survives in two overlapping forms. One is the historian's reconstruction, cautious and incomplete, made from settlement patterns, climate data, inscriptions, broken statues and scattered tablets. The other is the ancient memory of a cursed city where gods withdraw and greatness turns to dust. Between them lies the mystery. Not a mystery of whether Akkad fell because it did, but of how human beings transform collapse into meaning. The empire vanished from power, and its capital vanished from sight. But the story of its fall remained alive because later generations needed Akkad to speak. They needed it to warn kings, explain suffering, and remind the living that no city, however splendid, stands beyond judgment. The Gutians enter the story like figures seen through dust at the edge of the plain. Later, Mesopotamian tradition makes them almost the face of Akkad's destruction. The rough mountain people who descend when the gods withdraw their protection, and civilized order breaks apart. They are blamed for devastation, disorder, broken roads, ruined fields, and a time when kingship itself seems to stumble. In the moral memory of the curse of Akkad, they are not just political enemies, they are punishment made human. Yet the closer one looks, the less simple they become. The Gutians were real, but the role they played in Akkad's fall remains one of the most difficult and debated parts of the story. They are usually associated with the Zagros region, the rugged lands east and northeast of Mesopotamia. To the lowland scribes of Sumer and Akkad, these upland zones were both necessary and threatening. They were necessary because Mesopotamia depended on materials that came from beyond the alluvial plain metals, stone, timber, from connected roots, animals, and access to wider exchange networks. They were threatening because mountains sheltered people who were harder for lowland states to count, tax, and control. A canal city could be besieged, a field system could be mapped, a temple archive could be seized, but upland communities could retreat into difficult terrain, move along routes unfamiliar to lowland armies, and return when imperial attention shifted elsewhere. This does not mean the Gutians were primitive destroyers, though Mesopotamian texts often describe them in hostile terms. Such descriptions belong to a long tradition in which settled states portray outsiders as chaotic, uncultured, or dangerous, especially when those outsiders disrupt trade or defeat royal power. The words used against mountain peoples tell us about fear and contempt, not only about reality. What survives in the record suggests that the Gutians may have been a collection of groups rather than a single unified nation in the later sense. Their political organization is unclear. Their language is poorly understood. Their own voice is almost absent. We mostly see them through the eyes of people who disliked or feared them, which makes certainty difficult. It is possible that Gutian groups took advantage of Akkad's weakening rather than causing it alone. This distinction matters. A strong empire can absorb raids, repel enemies, and turn frontier conflict into royal glory. A weakened empire may experience the same pressures as disaster. If drought strains the north, if cities rebel in the south, if officials lose confidence, and if armies are stretched thin, then attacks from the Zagros become far more dangerous. The Gutians may have entered a system already cracking. Later scribes seeking a clear villain could then remember them as the main cause of the collapse. No single explanation fully accounts for Akkad's fall, and the Gutians are best understood as part of a wider breakdown rather than a lone hammer blow. The image of invasion is also too neat. Movement across ancient frontiers often includes raiding, migration, trade, intermarriage, military service, and shifting alliances all at once. Some Gutians may have fought Akkadian forces. Some may have entered Mesopotamia as opportunistic war bands. Some may have been drawn by hunger pasture needs or the wealth of exposed cities. Some may even have served in armies or negotiated with local powers. The line between enemy and participant can blur quickly in a collapsing imperial landscape. Royal inscriptions prefer clarity. Enemies are defeated. Rebels are crushed. Outsiders are named. Real life is less tidy. After Akkad's decline later, king lists preserve a Gutian dynasty ruling in Mesopotamia, though the details are frustrating. The Sumerian king list gives a sequence of Gutian rulers, but their reign lengths are irregular, sometimes suspiciously short, and the list itself is a literary and ideological document, not a simple chronicle. It presents kingship as something that moves from city to city, dynasty to dynasty, as if political authority has a single sacred thread. When the Gutians appear in this tradition, they are fitted into a Mesopotamian framework of legitimacy, even as other texts treat them as symbols of disorder. This contradiction is revealing. They are both outsiders blamed for chaos and rulers remembered within the official sequence of kingship. A lesser-known detail is that the Gutian period may not have been equally destructive everywhere. Later southern texts often portray their rule as catastrophic, but archaeological and regional evidence suggests variation. Some cities may have suffered more than others. Some local rulers may have maintained power under reduced or shifting conditions. In places such as Lagash, local leaders like Gudea emerge after the Akkadian collapse, in a world that is politically fragmented but culturally active. Temples are built, inscriptions are made, and artistic production continues. This does not mean the collapse was gentle. It means that the end of empire did not mean the end of civilization. It meant the end of one political structure and the reorganization of life under new pressures. The Gutians may also have served as convenient scapegoats for later Mesopotamian memory. When an empire fails, blame often moves outward. Foreigners become easier to accuse than administrative weakness, elite conflict, environmental stress, or the suffering caused by the empire itself. To say that outsiders ruined Akkad is simpler than to say Akkad had become difficult to sustain. It also protects the idea of kingship. If disaster comes mainly from barbarian intrusion, then the system itself remains honourable. If disaster comes from overextension, extraction, arrogance, and ecological vulnerability, then the lesson is more uncomfortable. Yet it would be equally wrong to dismiss Gutian violence as mere propaganda. Frontier groups could and did pose real threats. Raids could destroy crops, interrupt routes, seize animals, and spread fear. If Gutian forces captured cities or controlled parts of Mesopotamia, their impact would have been deeply felt. Roads becoming unsafe is not a literary detail only. It is a material crisis. Trade depends on trust and movement. Farmers depend on predictable access to fields and canals. Temples depend on offerings arriving. If armed groups disrupt these patterns, the consequences spread quickly. The Gutians may have been exaggerated in later memory, but exaggeration often grows from a real seed of trauma. The problem is that the sources do not let us measure that seed with precision. We do not know exactly how many Gutian fighters entered Mesopotamia, which cities they controlled directly, how their leadership worked, or how ordinary people experienced their rule. We know they became central to the story of Akkad's end, and we know that later kings gained prestige by claiming to defeat or expel them. Utuhengal of Uruk, and then the rulers of the third dynasty of Ur, would later present the restoration of order after Gutian domination as a major achievement. That restoration narrative needs the Gutians to be disorderly so that the new kings can appear as saviours. In this way, the Gutians stand at the crossroads of history and memory. Historically, they likely contributed to Akkad's weakening, or benefited from it, especially in a time when the imperial centre could no longer control every route and province. In memory, they became the dark mirror of civilization, the outsiders who showed what happens when divine order abandons the land. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the balance between real military impact and later literary demonization. But perhaps the most important point is that Akkad's fall created a vacuum large enough for such groups to matter. Strong centres make frontiers manageable. Weak centres turn frontiers into fate. So the Gutians at the gates are not the whole answer, but they are part of the final pressure. They reveal how vulnerable Akkad has become once its internal cracks meet environmental stress and local rebellion. The empire that once pushed into mountain lands now finds mountain peoples pressing back into its own story. Whether they came as conquerors, raiders, migrants, opportunists, or all of these at different moments, they became inseparable from the memory of collapse. And in that memory, the edge of the world moves inward until the heartland itself feels exposed. As Akkad weakens, it does not disappear in one clean stroke. Ancient collapse rarely works that way. There is no single moment when every scribe puts down his stylus, every soldier abandons his post, every temple closes its doors, and every city agrees that the empire is over. Instead, power thins. Commands that once carried weight begin to arrive late or not at all. A royal name that once caused obedience begins to sound distant. Provinces that once sent tribute hesitate. Local rulers discover that the centre can no longer punish everyone. The map does not shatter like pottery. It frays like old cloth thread by thread until the pattern is no longer recognizable. The final kings of Akkad are far dimmer than Sargon and Naram-Sin. Their names survive, but their presence in history is faint, almost spectral. After Naram-Sin comes Shar-Kali-Shari, a ruler who seems to inherit not the full confidence of empire, but a world already under heavy strain. His inscriptions still speak in the language of kingship and military action, and he appears to campaign against enemies on several fronts, including Elamites, Amorites, and Gutians. The fact that so many threats appear in the record may reflect his energy, but it also suggests pressure from every direction. A strong empire can call such campaigns proof of dominance. A weakening one may be revealing the number of fires it's trying to put out. Shar-Kali-Shari's reign stands in the shadow of a shrinking horizon. The older Akkadian claim to universal reach becomes harder to sustain. Rebellions and frontier conflicts are not glorious exceptions. They begin to look like the normal condition of rule. The king still builds fights and dedicates offerings, but the imperial machine no longer seems to expand with the force it had under Sargon or Naram-Sin. What survives in the record suggests an authority trying to preserve itself rather than confidently remaking the world. That shift matters. Empires can survive defensive periods, but once they stop appearing inevitable, local alternatives become easier to imagine. Then the record grows confused. Later king lists preserve a sequence after Shar-Kali-Shari that is difficult to interpret, including a famous line asking who was king and naming several contenders. This glimpse is extraordinary because it suggests a period of disputed succession or political fragmentation at the very centre of Akkadian power. The precise historicity of the list remains debated, but the image is powerful. Kingship itself has become uncertain. Where Sargon once projected command outward, later memory sees confusion inward. A throne that cannot clearly name its occupant cannot easily command distant cities. This uncertainty may reflect civil conflict, rapid turnover, regional breakaway, or the collapse of central administration. The evidence remains incomplete, and the surviving tradition is filtered through later scribal purposes. But even if the exact sequence is unclear, the broader reality is hard to miss. Akkad's dynastic continuity breaks down. The empire's ability to present a single authoritative king weakens. In a world where legitimacy depends on royal power, divine favour, and administrative recognition, confusion at the top spreads downward quickly. Officials begin to hedge, cities test their freedom, soldiers follow whoever pays or feeds them, temples look again toward local patrons. The centre becomes one power among others rather than the power above all. At the same time, the capital itself slips deeper into mystery. Akkad, the city, should have been the place where this drama left its clearest traces. One would expect palaces, temples, administrative buildings, destruction layers, royal inscriptions, workshops, and streets full of imperial memory. Yet because the city has not been securely found, the collapse of Akkad's heart remains strangely invisible. We can watch the empire weaken from the edges, from later texts from other cities, from changed political patterns, but the central stage is missing. It is as if the main scene of the drama has been cut from the surviving film. This absence forces caution. It is tempting to imagine Akkad burned by invaders, emptied by famine, or swallowed by river mud, but none of these can be stated as fact without the site itself. The city may lie buried beneath later occupation, perhaps under a mound not yet identified, It may have been damaged by river shifts or covered by alluvial deposits. It may be near modern settlements where excavation is difficult. It may have been found in part without being recognized. Scholars still debate its location, and until stronger evidence appears, Akkad remains one of archaeology's most important missing capitals. The empire's name is everywhere in history, but its urban body is absent. Beyond the missing capital, other signs point toward fragmentation. Formerly subordinate cities and regions begin to reassert themselves. Local rulers appear with renewed importance. In southern Mesopotamia, places such as Lagash become prominent in the post-Akkadian world. In the north, settlement disruptions and changing patterns suggest that some areas were reorganized, abandoned, or reduced. The old network that allowed Akkadian power to move across Mesopotamia no longer holds with the same strength. Roads may become unsafe. Tribute routes may fail. Governors may become independent. The distinction between imperial province, rebellious city, and local kingdom begins to blur. One lesser-known feature of collapse is that administration can continue in fragments even after imperial authority fades. A city does not stop counting grain because the empire weakens. Temples still need offerings. Workers still need rations. Fields still need management. Scribes continue to write, but the names and priorities in their tablets change. This means the end of Akkad is not the end of Mesopotamian civilization, literacy, or urban life. It is the end of a particular arrangement of power. The clay tablets do not fall silent everywhere. They begin speaking for smaller worlds again. This distinction matters because later stories of collapse often exaggerate total ruin. To those who suffered violence, hunger, migration, or political disorder, the fall may indeed have felt like the end of the world. But history shows both rupture and continuity. Some settlements decline, some communities move, some elites vanish, others adapt, temples survive, local dynasties rise. The memory of empire remains useful even after the empire itself is gone. Life narrows, but it does not stop. Still, there must have been a profound psychological shock in watching Akkad fade. For generations, people had lived under an authority that claimed to rule the four quarters. The king's name moved through cities, seals, soldiers, and tribute. His victories were carved into stone and written into clay. His family entered sacred offices. His officials stood between local life and imperial demand. Then gradually or violently that authority no longer held. The distant king became less relevant than the local strongman, the nearby temple, the armed band on the road, the condition of the canal, the amount of grain left in storage. The wide world shrank back into dangerous fragments. The vanishing from the record is therefore not just a problem for modern historians. It may reflect the ancient experience itself, clarity dissolving into uncertainty. Who is king? Which city is safe? Which road can be travelled? Which god has turned away? Which official still has power? What happens when the name that once ordered the world no longer orders anything? Akkad's collapse is haunting, because it leaves so many questions half-lit. The empire does not end with a final speech or a clear last battle. It fades through broken sequences, disputed names, missing ruins, and the return of local histories. By the time Akkad has truly vanished as an imperial force, its absence is already shaping the future. The old city-states are no longer exactly what they were before Sargon. They have lived under empire. They have learned from it, suffered from it, and inherited some of its tools. Later rulers will not simply restore the past. They will build new forms of centralized power with Akkad's example behind them, both as inspiration and warning. The first empire disappears, but it leaves a memory of scale that cannot be forgotten. And somewhere still hidden beneath the Mesopotamian earth, the capital remains silent. Its walls, if they survive, do not yet speak. Its streets do not yet guide us. Its destruction, abandonment, or transformation remains unknown. The empire that once made distant cities answer to one name now depends on scattered fragments to be remembered at all. Akkad vanishes from the record not into nothingness, but into a fog of broken evidence where every surviving trace feels precious and every missing piece feels enormous. After Akkad's silence, Mesopotamia does not become empty. This is one of the most important truths to hold on to because collapse can easily be imagined as a curtain falling over the land, leaving only ruins, hunger, and wandering survivors. The reality is more complicated. The empire breaks, but the cities do not all die. The temples do not all fall still. The canals do not all vanish beneath dust. People continue to plant, repair, bargain, worship, marry, mourn, count, and remember. What changes is the scale of power. The wide imperial shadow withdraws, and beneath it smaller worlds begin to breathe again, wounded but alive. For ordinary people, the aftermath of empire may have felt less like liberation or catastrophe in any simple sense, and more like uncertainty becoming part of daily life. A farmer who once owed grain to an Akkadian official may now owe it to a local ruler, a temple household, or a military strongman. A scribe who once wrote under imperial formulas may continue pressing signs into clay, but now for a different master. A priest may find that the city's god has regained local importance, or that offerings have become harder to secure because fields and trade routes are unstable. A merchant may discover that roads once protected by imperial force now require new agreements, new escorts, or new risks. The empire's disappearance does not remove authority, it rearranges it. In southern Mesopotamia, local powers re-emerge with striking vitality. Lagash, especially under rulers such as Gudea, becomes one of the clearest examples of post-Akkadian recovery. Gudea is not an Akkadian emperor. He does not rule the four quarters. His world is smaller, more city-centered, more rooted in the old pattern of a local kingship. Yet his inscriptions and statues reveal a society capable of impressive organization, religious devotion, artistic production, and long-distance exchange. Diorite for his statues comes from far away. Timber, metals, and stone still move through networks that survive or revive after imperial collapse. This is a surprising detail for anyone who imagines the post-Akkadian age as only darkness. Political unity has failed, but craftsmanship and ambition remain. Gudea's world also shows how memory shifts after collapse. Instead of boasting mainly in the language of universal conquest, his inscriptions often emphasize temple-building, divine dreams, piety, and the gathering of materials for sacred construction. This does not mean his rule is gentle or without political calculation. Temple building is power. Piety is legitimacy. The ability to summon rare materials from distant lands is a statement of authority. But the tone differs from Akkadian imperial thunder. After the storm of kings who climbed mountains and wore divine horns, the local ruler rebuilding a god's house offers another model of order. It is as if Mesopotamia, having endured the strain of empire, turns again toward the sacred city as a stable center. Farther south, will soon rise into a new centralized power under the third dynasty of This later state, often called III, inherits both the older Sumerian city tradition and the lessons of Akkad. It creates a highly organized administrative system, uses writing on a massive scale, and projects authority across much of southern Mesopotamia. In some ways, III looks like a restoration. In others, it is a successor to Akkad's imperial experiment. It proves that Akkad's collapse did not end the dream of a large-scale rule. It changed the vocabulary of that dream. Future rulers now know that a king can command beyond one city, But they also know that such command must be managed with relentless attention to labour-grain officials, roads and gods. The human consequences of Akkad's fall are harder to see than the political ones. Archaeology can detect abandoned settlements, changes in pottery, shifts in administrative practice, and new patterns of power, but it cannot easily recover the private grief of a family leaving a dry field or a worker watching rations shrink. In northern Mesopotamia, some communities appear to decline or relocate in connection with environmental stress and changing political conditions. If drought played a major role, then the aftermath would have included migration hunger and the painful search for more reliable land. Yet even here, scholars still debate the details because settlement change can result from many causes. War trade disruption, political collapse, and climate pressure can leave similar traces in the ground. What survives in the record suggests a period of fragmentation, but fragmentation is not the same as disappearance. People adapt to smaller horizons. They strengthen local ties. They rely on kin temples, city walls, and nearby fields. Some may welcome the end of Akkadian extraction. Others may suffer from the loss of imperial order, especially if roads become unsafe or irrigation coordination weakens. For elites who had prospered under Akkad, collapse may mean danger. For rival local families, it may mean opportunity. For the poor, the name of the ruler may matter less than whether grain arrives, whether animals survive, and whether armed men come through the settlement. The end of Akkad also changes the emotional landscape of kingship. Later rulers cannot pretend the first empire never existed. They inherit its memory as both temptation and warning. Sargon's reach remains dazzling. Naram-Sin's divine ambition remains unforgettable. The collapse remains troubling. Any king who dreams of wide control must now live with the knowledge that wide control can fail spectacularly. This is one reason later Mesopotamian political culture becomes so rich in reflections on proper kingship. A ruler must be strong but not reckless, chosen by gods but not contemptuous of them, capable of conquest but also of building, feeding and restoring. Akkad's fall teaches that power without balance becomes vulnerable. There is also continuity in language and identity. Akkadian does not vanish with the empire. Over time it becomes one of the great languages of Mesopotamian administration, literature, diplomacy and scholarship. Sumerian too continues in religious, literary and scribal contexts long after it ceases to be spoken as an everyday language. This layered linguistic world is one of Akkad's lasting legacies. The empire may fall, but the cultural fusion it helped accelerate continues to shape Mesopotamia for centuries. The scribal schools of later ages preserve both Sumerian and Akkadian traditions, copying old texts, reshaping memories, and turning the past into a curriculum for future elites. In the countryside, the rivers keep moving with a patience older than kings. Canals still require clearing, fields still demand timing, date palms still need care. The land remains both generous and severe. Collapse may alter rulers, but it does not alter the basic bargain between humans and the Mesopotamian environment. Survival still depends on managing water, labor, soil and storage. The same forces that made cities possible before Akkad continue after it. The same vulnerabilities remain. The first empire has fallen, but the landscape that produced it is still capable of producing new experiments in power, so the aftermath is not silence in the sense of absence. It is silence only where Akkad's imperial voice once spoke. In that quiet, other voices return: local rulers dedicating temples, scribes recording rations, priests invoking city gods, workers carrying baskets of earth to repair canals, merchants testing old routes under new risks. The world has narrowed, but it has not ended. Akkad's collapse becomes part of Mesopotamia's memory, not as a final ruin, but as a deep scar beneath later rebuilding. The empire is gone, yet its tools, warnings and ambitions remain scattered in the hands of those who come after. Memory does not preserve Akkad as a simple ruin. It reshapes it, polishes it, darkens it, and turns it into a mirror for later kings. Long after the empire has vanished, as a living political force, Sargon and Naram-Sin continue to move through Mesopotamian imagination. They are no longer only rulers of the past. They become examples, warnings, legends, and measuring rods for ambition. Their names are copied by scribes who never saw their cities invoked by kings, who want to stand in their shadow, and folded into stories where history and myth press so closely together that the seam almost disappears. Akkad dies as an empire but survives as a memory of what power once dared to be. Sargon becomes the great model of rise and conquest. Later generations remember him as the man who came from uncertain beginnings and seized the world. The details of his origin story with the hidden birth and the river basket carry the shape of destiny. Whether or not the legend preserves anything from his actual childhood, it gives later audiences a powerful lesson. Greatness may appear from outside the expected line of inheritance. A king does not need to be remembered only as the son of a king. He can be the chosen man, lifted by fate, favoured by gods, recognised by victory. This makes Sargon especially useful in political imagination. Rulers who lack perfect legitimacy can find comfort in him. Conquerors can find a precedent. Scribes can find drama. But Sargon's memory is not merely romantic, it is also imperial. He represents the possibility that the world can be gathered under one authority. Later kings in Mesopotamia and beyond look back to earlier conquerors to strengthen their own claims, and Sargon becomes one of the deepest ancestors of that habit. To be like Sargon is to be more than a local ruler. It is to be a king whose name travels, whose campaigns reshape geography, whose power reaches beyond familiar boundaries. Even when his real empire is gone, the idea of Sargon remains politically alive. The first superpower leaves behind the first great imperial nostalgia. Naram-Sin's memory is more complicated. He's admired for power but feared for overreach. The same ruler who appears in victory art as almost superhuman becomes in later literature the king whose arrogance invites disaster. This double image gives him unusual depth. He is not simply condemned because his greatness is too large to erase. He is not simply celebrated because his fall is too useful as a warning. He becomes the kind of figure ancient thought often returns to the brilliant ruler who crosses a boundary that should not have been crossed. In him, kingship reaches toward divinity, and then discovers that the heavens are not easily mastered. This transformation from ruler to symbol tells us a great deal about Mesopotamian political culture. Later scribes were not writing history in the modern sense, but they were deeply interested in the moral shape of the past. They copied inscriptions, composed legends, preserved king lists, and reflected on why dynasties rose and fell. They understood that the past could instruct the present. Akkad became part of that instruction. It taught that conquest could create greatness, but also that greatness without restraint could become ruin. It taught that kings needed divine favour, but also that claiming too much closeness to the divine could become dangerous. It taught that cities could be bound together but not without cost. The Sumerian king list is one of the clearest examples of how memory becomes structured. It presents kingship as something that descends from heaven and moves from city to city across time. This is not a neutral historical table, it is a theological and political vision of order. By placing dynasties in sequence, it turns messy histories of conflict overlap and regional variation into a single flowing line of legitimacy. Akkad appears within that larger pattern not just as a state that once existed, but as a stage in the sacred journey of kingship. The list simplifies, compresses, and arranges. It gives the past a pattern that real life probably never had while people were living through it. This is one of the strange comforts of later memory. Collapse feels chaotic when it happens, but afterwards scribes can place it in order. They can assign kings count reigns, name dynasties, and explain transfers of power. They can make the broken past legible. The evidence remains incomplete, and many details in such lists must be handled carefully, but the impulse behind them is deeply human. People want the ruins behind them to mean something. They want disaster to fit inside a story larger than fear. Akkad also survives through copied royal inscriptions and literary traditions that continue to circulate in scribal schools. Students learning the difficult art of writing encounter the names of ancient kings. They copy signs that preserve victories, gods, cities, and curses from centuries earlier. In this way, the empire becomes part of education. A young scribe may never see the lost capital, may not know where it stood, may live under a completely different dynasty, yet he can still write the name of Sargon. The vanished empire enters the hand, the memory, and the discipline of the scribal class. Clay becomes a medium not only of administration but of cultural survival. A lesser-known and fascinating feature of this afterlife is how later texts sometimes create fictional or semi-fictional adventures for Sargon and Naram-Sin. They are sent against strange lands, impossible enemies, or distant territories at the edge of the known world. These stories may preserve faint memories of real campaigns, but they also expand the kings into legendary heroes. The more distant they become in time, the more flexible they become as characters. History gives them names. Imagination gives them new landscapes. Akkad becomes not only an empire that once ruled, but a stage on which later Mesopotamians can explore fear, ambition, danger, and the limits of human command. This does not mean later people misunderstood everything. Mythologizing the past is not the same as forgetting it. Often myth preserves what facts alone cannot carry the emotional size of an event. Sargon's legend preserves the shock of unprecedented rise. Naram-Sin's curse preserves anxiety about sacred limits and imperial pride. Gutian chaos preserves memories of insecurity after collapse. These stories may distort the details, but they keep alive the sense that Akkad mattered. A minor kingdom does not generate this kind of afterlife. Akkad becomes myth because it had changed what kingship could imagine. For later rulers, the memory is tempting. To invoke Akkad is to touch the deep past of empire. But it is also dangerous because the same memory contains failure. A king may want Sargon's glory, but not Naram-Sin's curse. He may want universal rule, but not divine abandonment. This tension runs through much of Mesopotamian kingship after Akkad. The ideal ruler must conquer but also restore. He must command armies but also build temples. He must receive divine favor but remain properly reverent. He must be larger than ordinary men, but not so large that he threatens the order of the gods. Akkad's memory helps define that balance by showing what happens when balance breaks. The lost capital's absence deepens the myth. If Akkad had been continuously visible as a ruined city, its stones might have anchored memory in a specific place. Instead, the city becomes almost more powerful because it is missing. It exists in names, stories, inscriptions, and the imagination of later scribes. It can be splendid, cursed, proud, ruined, and unreachable all at once. Its invisibility allows it to become a symbol of vanished greatness itself. The capital that once controlled the land becomes a blank space onto which Mesopotamia projects the drama of rise and fall. So memory turns Akkad into more than history. It becomes a language for thinking about power across time. Sargon is the impossible ascent. Naram-Sin is the dangerous summit. The Gutians are the feared disorder beyond the edge. The curse is the moral explanation for collapse. The missing city is the silence beneath all of it. Together they form an ancient meditation on empire long before later empires would carve their own versions of the same lesson into stone. Akkad's armies are gone. Its officials are gone. Its capital is hidden. Yet its story keeps ruling the imagination, because once human beings have seen a world gathered under one name, they do not easily forget either the glory or the cost. The search for Akkad begins with an absence so large that it almost feels impossible. Here is the capital of the first empire in history, the city whose name defined a dynasty, a language, a region, and an age, and yet no excavated mound can be pointed to with complete confidence and called Akkad. Other ancient cities of Mesopotamia have returned to the map through ruins, tablets, walls, temples, and debris. Ur has its great ziggurat. Uruk has its immense urban history. Nippur has its sacred archives and temples. Lagash, Kish Mari Abla, and many others have yielded enough material to anchor them in the modern imagination. But Akkad, the city from which Sargon and his successors projected power over the known world, remains hidden unnamed beneath the soil, or perhaps buried beneath later life so deeply that its imperial identity still escapes recognition. This is one of the most haunting problems in Near Eastern archaeology. It is not that scholars have no clues. Ancient texts mention Akkad often enough to show that it was real and important. They suggest it stood somewhere in northern Babylonia, in the broad zone between the older Sumerian south and the regions farther north, where Akkadian-speaking populations were prominent. It may have been near the Diyala region near Kish, somewhere close to old river routes, or in an area now difficult to excavate because of modern settlement, alluvial deposits, and changes in the river landscape. Scholars still debate its location, and each proposal has to wrestle with the same difficulty. The textual clues are suggestive but not decisive. The landscape itself conspires against certainty. Mesopotamian cities were built mostly of mud brick, a material that can preserve in great masses under the right conditions, but also erodes, melts, and collapses back into the earth. A city abandoned for centuries becomes a mound or tell made of its own accumulated ruins. But river plains are restless, channels shift, floods bury, silt covers old surfaces. Later settlements reuse older bricks, build over earlier layers, and disturb what came before. In some areas, ancient levels may lie beneath meters of alluvium. In others, modern towns, farms, roads, and political realities make excavation difficult or impossible. The lost capital may not be lost because it is far away. It may be lost because it is too deeply entangled with everything that came after. This makes Akkad different from some lost cities imagined in popular culture. It is not likely waiting as a perfectly preserved ruin under untouched sand with palace gates ready to open and royal archives sitting in neat rows. The real search is slower, harder, and more ambiguous. Archaeologists look for settlement patterns, pottery sequences, inscriptions, ceilings, administrative tablets, architectural remains, and regional connections. They compare ancient place names later, geographical references, and the logic of imperial control. A capital needs access to routes, resources, and political zones. It must be defensible enough to matter, connected enough to govern, and symbolically positioned enough to command both Sumerian and Akkadian worlds. But ancient kings did not choose capitals for the convenience of modern scholars, and the rivers have not kept their old promises. Kish has often drawn attention because of its prestige and location. Sargon's association with Kish in later tradition makes the area tempting. If he rose from that political environment, perhaps Akkad was nearby positioned to inherit Kish's aura while creating a new royal centre. Other proposals place Akkad closer to the Diyala or along old Euphrates channels. Some theories are stronger than others, but none has settled the matter beyond debate. The evidence remains incomplete, and that incompleteness should not be disguised. Akkad is not undiscovered because no one has cared to look. It is undiscovered because the ancient landscape is difficult, the textual evidence is imprecise, and the material signature of a capital can be surprisingly hard to isolate without a clear inscription naming the place. There is also the possibility that Akkad has already been touched by excavation but not recognized. Archaeology often advances when old finds are reinterpreted under new questions. A site excavated decades ago might contain levels, tablets, or architectural patterns that gain new meaning when compared with fresh evidence. A fragmentary inscription, a seal impression, or a cluster of administrative remains could shift a debate. Yet capital cities are usually not identified by one clue alone. The strongest case would require convergence text naming the city Akkadian period, monumental remains administrative evidence, regional fit and continuity with later references. Until such convergence appears, Akkad remains suspended between the map and the imagination. The missing capital also distorts the way the empire is studied. Without Akkad itself, historians must reconstruct imperial life from the provinces, the conquered cities, the later memories, and scattered royal inscriptions. This gives the empire an oddly decentralized afterlife. We know it through places it ruled, not through the place that ruled them. We see its shadow in Nippur, Susa, Tel Brak and other sites where Akkadian power or influence appears. We read later copies of royal inscriptions and literary texts. We study art objects that travelled far from their original contexts. The centre is inferred from the edges. That can be powerful, but it is also limiting. It means the most intimate questions about Akkad's capital remain unanswered. How large was it? What did its palace look like? How were its temples arranged? Did its streets display the wealth of empire, or was its power more administrative than monumental? Did it fall violently, decline gradually, or transform into another settlement under a different name? One lesser-known consequence of the missing city is that Akkad's very urban character remains uncertain in texture. It must have been important, but importance can take different forms. Was it an enormous metropolis rivaling the great Sumerian cities? Was it a newly founded royal capital designed to break with older city loyalties? Was it an expanded older settlement renamed or elevated by Sargon? Did it function mainly as a ceremonial and administrative centre, with power distributed through older cities? Scholars can infer possibilities, but without the site, each answer remains provisional. The name Akkad is huge in history, yet the city behind the name is still strangely weightless, and perhaps that is why it fascinates. The absence forces the imagination to slow down. It prevents the story from becoming too neat. If Akkad had been found with a burned palace and a royal archive describing the final days, the mystery would be smaller. Instead, the capital's disappearance mirrors the empire's collapse. Both are known through traces rather than completion. Both require caution. Both resist the satisfying finality of a single answer. The lost city becomes a reminder that even the most important human creations can pass into uncertainty. Not because they were imaginary, but because time is patient. Rivers move, mud brick, returns to dust, and memory survives unevenly. Modern archaeology continues to refine the search using survey remote sensing, environmental reconstruction satellite imagery, and renewed study of old texts and landscapes. These methods can reveal buried channels, settlement clusters, and patterns invisible from the ground. Yet technology does not remove uncertainty by magic. A satellite image can show a mound or ancient watercourse, but only excavation context and evidence can turn possibility into identification. Akkad may still emerge from the earth one day. It may be named by a tablet found in the right layer, a royal inscription in the right place, or a pattern no one has yet recognized. Or it may remain hidden for generations, its capital city continuing to rule history through absence. For now, the search itself becomes part of Akkad's story. The First Empire is not only a subject of ancient memory, it is an unfinished modern investigation. Every proposed location, every uncertain tablet, every buried river channel adds to the sense that the past is not simply behind us neatly arranged. It is beneath us, partial and stubborn, waiting in fragments. Somewhere in the earth of Iraq, perhaps under Field's house's silt, or an unremarkable mound, the capital of Sargon may still lie silent. Until it is found, Akkad remains both empire and ghost, a power that once claimed the 4 quarters of the world, yet now withholds its own address. Akkad's disappearance has always invited a single answer because the human mind prefers a clean ending. A drought killed it. The Gutians destroyed it. Naram-Sin offended the gods. The cities rebelled. The empire grew too large. The kings after Sargon were weaker. The fields failed. The roads became unsafe. Each answer contains a piece of the truth, but none is large enough to hold the whole ruin. The First Empire did not vanish because one thread snapped. It vanished because too many threads were pulled at once until the fabric that Sargon had stretched across Mesopotamia could no longer hold its shape. The most tempting explanation is climate because it gives collapse the force of something vast and impersonal. Around the time Akkad weakens, evidence suggests that parts of the Near East experience severe aridity. The 4.2 kiloyear event, as modern researchers call it, may have reduced rainfall, disrupted agriculture, weakened pasture lands, and pushed populations into movement. In northern Mesopotamia, especially where farming depended more directly on rain than on the great irrigation systems of the South, drought could have been devastating. Settlements may have shrunk or emptied. Grain production may have fallen. Herders may have sought new grazing lands. Routes that once connected the empire may have become corridors of stress. In this view, Akkad is not simply defeated by enemies. It is undermined by a changing environment that no royal inscription can command. But climate alone cannot explain everything. Drought does not strike every region equally, and societies respond to environmental pressure in different ways. Some adapt, some move, some centralize more strongly, some fragment. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how directly the arid episode can be tied to Akkad's collapse. The empire's southern heartland relied heavily on irrigation, which could buffer drought in some ways while creating other vulnerabilities. Canals, labour systems and storage could help communities endure dry years, but only if political coordination remained strong. If the state was already strained, then drought became not a single cause but an amplifier. It made existing weaknesses sharper. Those weaknesses were real. Akkad ruled over older cities that had never stopped being themselves. Sumerian urban identity did not dissolve under Akkadian administration. The great cities obeyed when they had to, rebelled when they could, and preserved memories of local gods, rulers, and rites. Rebellion appears repeatedly in the history of the dynasty, not only at the very end. This matters because it shows that Akkad's authority required constant enforcement. The empire may have looked unified from the royal viewpoint, but from below it was a negotiated and often resented structure. As long as the centre remained strong, local resistance could be crushed. When the centre weakened, resistance became opportunity. The empire's administrative success also carried hidden costs. To govern many cities, Akkad needed officials, soldiers, messengers, storehouses, scribes, and loyal intermediaries. It needed grain to feed the machine and prestige goods to reward those who served it. It needed temples to cooperate and local elites to calculate that obedience was safer than revolt. But the larger the machine became, the more it consumed. Expansion brought tribute, but it also brought expense. Distant campaigns glorified the king, but they required supply. Frontier control opened access to resources, but also demanded military attention. The empire's reach was its pride and also its burden. Then there were the frontiers. The Gutians and other groups from upland or marginal zones were not imaginary threats. They could raid, disrupt, migrate, and exploit weakness. Later, Mesopotamian tradition may have exaggerated and demonized them, turning them into symbols of divine punishment and social chaos. But that does not mean they were harmless. If roads became unsafe, if trade faltered, if provincial towns felt exposed, the imperial system lost one of its essential promises: order. Empires justify extraction by claiming to provide security. When they continue to demand but can no longer protect loyalty, decays quickly. Royal ideology added another layer of fragility. Sargon's empire had created a new scale of kingship, and Naram-Sin pushed that scale almost into the heavens. The king became more than a city ruler, more than a conqueror, perhaps even divine. This gave Akkad an aura of extraordinary power, but it also raised the stakes of failure. A local king can lose a battle and remain a king. A ruler of the four quarters, favoured by gods and elevated above ordinary men, has far less room to appear weak. When famine, rebellion, and invasion strike under such an ideology, they do not look like normal misfortune. They look like cosmic contradiction. Later scribes would turn that contradiction into the curse of Akkad, but the emotional logic may already have existed in the age itself. No single explanation fully accounts for the collapse because Akkad was not a simple organism. It was a network of cities, fields, canals, temples, officials, soldiers, roads, languages, gods, memories, and ambitions. Its failure was systemic before the word existed. Drought could reduce surplus. Reduced surplus could weaken administration. Weakened administration could embolden rebels. Rebellion could force military campaigns. Campaigns could drain resources. Frontier attacks could disrupt trade. Disrupted trade could reduce prestige and supply. Religious doubt could undermine legitimacy. Succession disputes could fracture the center. Each pressure made the next more dangerous. Collapse was not a line, it was a spiral. Yet Akkad's fall should not be mistaken for total erasure. The empire vanished, but Mesopotamia endured. Cities recovered, reformed, and competed again. Local rulers built temples and commissioned statues. The third dynasty of Ur later created another powerful centralized state, one that learned from Akkad even as it claimed its own legitimacy. Akkadian language continued to grow in importance. Sumerian scribal culture survived and transformed. Sargon and Naram-Sin became figures of memory, copied, admired, feared, and reimagined. The capital remained lost, but the idea of empire did not. Once Akkad had shown that many cities could be gathered beneath one authority, the possibility could never be fully forgotten. This may be Akkad's deepest legacy. It was the first great warning that empire is not only conquest, empire is maintenance. It is grain arriving on time, canals kept clear, officials kept loyal, roads kept open, gods kept honoured, soldiers kept fed, and local pride kept contained. It is the daily prevention of collapse. The royal inscriptions show victory as a moment the king defeats enemies, climbs, mountains, receives divine favour. But real power lives in repetition. It must work again tomorrow and the day after and the season after that. Akkad succeeded for as long as it could repeat its authority across distance. It failed when repetition became too costly, too doubtful, or too thin. The lost empire of Akkad therefore stands at the beginning of a long human pattern. Later empires will be larger, richer, better documented and more technologically complex, but many will face the same quiet truths. Expansion creates glory and strain. Diversity creates wealth and tension. Climate can expose political weakness. Ideology can inspire obedience and magnify failure. The center can rule only while the edges believe fear or benefit enough to remain attached. Akkad is ancient, but its lesson is not. It shows that civilization can be brilliant and brittle at the same time, and so the first superpower vanishes without surrendering a final answer. Its capital remains hidden, its collapse remains debated, its kings survive in fragments, legends, and clay. What remains is not a solved case, but a layered warning from the earliest age of empire power can rise faster than the systems needed to sustain it, and the world beneath a throne is always more complicated than the throne itself can admit. The wind returns to the plains softer now, moving over the places where the empire once gathered its strength. It crosses old fields where barley grew beneath a dangerous sun, old canals that carried both life and conflict, old city mounds, layered with the labour of people who never imagined they would become ancient. Somewhere beneath that landscape, the capital of Akkad still waits without a confirmed name on a modern map. Perhaps it lies under silt, perhaps under a later town, perhaps beneath a mound already walked over many times by people who did not know what slept below their feet. Its silence feels fitting because Akkad's story has always been partly about what power leaves behind and partly about what it fails to preserve. Sargon's empire was not eternal, though it spoke in the language of permanence. Naram-Sin's victories did not hold forever, though they were carved as if stone could make triumph immune to time. The scribes who pressed royal names into clay gave those kings a kind of survival, but even clay breaks, scatters, and waits to be found by hands from another world. The rivers changed, the rain weakened, the cities remembered themselves, the frontiers pressed inward. Officials, soldiers, priests, farmers, and labourers adjusted to a world where the great name of Akkad no longer organised their lives. What had seemed like the shape of history became one layer beneath another, and yet Akkad did not vanish completely. It remained as a possibility. It remained in the memory of later kings who dreamed of ruling more than one city in scribal schools where old names were copied long after their palaces had fallen, in stories where greatness became warning, and in the uneasy knowledge that civilization is never as secure as it appears from the top of its monuments. The first empire failed, but it taught the world how empires could imagine themselves. It taught the world that conquest can create order, but also that order must be fed, repaired, believed, and renewed. In the end, Akkad's mystery is not only where its capital lies or which pressure finally broke its power. It is the older, quieter mystery of all vanished civilizations, how something so commanding can become so fragile, how a king's name can travel across mountains and then survive only in fragments, how a city can rule the known world and still disappear into the earth. The plains remain. The dust moves. Beneath it, the first superpower sleeps not gone entirely, but lowered into memory, waiting in silence while the rivers continue toward the sea.